Boa tarde, muito obrigado a todos. Começo por agradecer a disponibilidade do Sr. Embaixador Sainty, Embaixador do Reino Unido, de vir conduzir esta nova sessão da Tertúlia Diplomática que estamos agora a retomar nas instalações do Palácio da Independência da Sociedade Histórica. Queria agradecer também a presença da Sra. Embaixadora da Suécia, a Embaixadora Elisabeth Eklund, e do representante da Embaixada da Suíça, também aqui o Sr. Almirante, Presidente do nosso Conselho Supremo, o Dr. Gustavo Mesquita Guimarães, o Dr. Francisco Ribeirinho, do Instituto da Mar da Costa. Agradeço muito a vossa presença. Esta sessão, enfim, realiza-se também em parceria com a Comissão das Comemorações dos 650 anos da Aliança Luso-Britânica, que é dirigida pela doutora Maria João Rodrigues de Araújo, nesta altura em Oxford, e que ela é que conduz um programa geral. Nós somos um pequeno apontamento. Mas não quisemos deixar de assinalar este marco notável da história política e diplomática portuguesa, e também, creio que de Inglaterra, e por via da Inglaterra, do Reino Unido, e que podemos caracterizar como uma extraordinária, uma notável inspiração geopolítica, uma intuição extraordinária, num tempo em que, certamente, a palavra geopolítica não era conhecida e não era usada. Mas é isso que explica a longevidade desta aliança e a importância que teve para Portugal, seguramente, e creio que também para o Reino Unido. Ela é celebrada no Reinado de Dom Fernando, ainda que seja mais conhecida a celebração, a confirmação no Reinado de Dom João I e depois consolidada no casamento com Filipa de Lencastre, que nos deu a ínclita geração, que nasceram grandes infantes, notáveis servidores de Portugal e do seu desígnio das descobertas. E é curioso que esta aliança já tinha tido uma tradução importante, que é um fruto da geografia. Na conquista de Lisboa em 1147, em que participaram os cruzados que passavam pela nossa costa para irem para a Terra Santa. E, pelo caminho, ajudaram a Cruzada do Ocidente, como também dizemos, ajudando o nosso rei, então já rei Dom Afonso Henriques, a conquistar aquilo que 2 séculos depois viria a ser a capital do país. E é uma aliança que está presente em momentos de grande perigo, decisivos para a manutenção ou não manutenção de Portugal. Foi assim na crise do Interregno, de 1383 a 85, é conhecida, nomeadamente, a presença dos militares ingleses, nomeadamente dos archeiros, na Batalha de Aljubarrota, uma das batalhas decisivas, e é isso que leva, nomeadamente, Dom João I a consolidar esta mesma aliança nos termos que já referi. A nossa guerra, a nossa guerra da independência, é também um episódio da Guerra dos 100 Anos que decorria na mesma altura. Não vou aprofundar isso, mas faz parte da política europeia do tempo. No século XVII, Portugal agiu também consciente da importância diplomática do Reino Unido, porque, obviamente, grande esforço português de 1640 a 1668 foi o de retirar apoio diplomático europeu ao rei de Espanha, que tinha, não esqueçamos, por si a lei das Cortes de 1580, portanto era preciso afirmar claramente os nossos direitos e a legitimidade do rei português, e esse trabalho foi feito em várias frentes europeias. Aliás, já aqui tivemos uma narrativa do esforço conduzido por o padre António Vieira, mas a Inglaterra foi sempre um objeto desse diálogo, e onde volta a ter uma importância decisiva esta aliança é na crise das invasões napoleónicas. Portanto, a cooperação militar e política com o Reino Unido é determinante, desde mesmo o período da Guerra das Laranjas, onde se foi a Olivença e o diálogo existia. Podemos, aliás, dizer que essa foi a primeira das invasões francesas, ou invasão zero, antes da primeira invasão, da segunda e da terceira, e o trabalho notável como militar de Wellington é bem conhecido e admirado pelos portugueses e também pelos britânicos. A nossa gratidão é imensa, devemos a esse apoio militar, capacidade de enfrentar essas invasões e rechaçá-las todas. E depois, no final, em 1814, os espanhóis já tinham mudado de campo, já estavam do lado do exército anglo-luso e são os 3 exércitos que têm uma das últimas batalhas em Toulouse com Napoleão. E, portanto, na frente ocidental, se a frente oriental foi muito com a Rússia e outras, na frente ocidental travou-se muito a resistência a Napoleão aqui no nosso país e nós ficámos muito devedores dessa aliança. E nunca desapareceu, ainda hoje se mantém. Isso nos falará também o nosso embaixador e é com muita curiosidade que o queremos ouvir. Eu também pedi ao Sr. Embaixador se nos dirigia umas palavras sobre o reinado de Carlos III, que agora se inicia. Nós estávamos muito habituados à Rainha Isabel II, parecia eterna, mas partiu, portanto, inicia-se um novo reinado. Tínhamos uma grande estima e consideração pela Rainha Isabel II, que visitou Portugal 2 vezes, em 2 visitas que decorreram de forma memorável e muito à altura do prestígio que tinha, e desejamos ao rei Carlos III as maiores felicidades e sucessos no Reino. Queríamos dizer que, apenas digo a título pessoal, que temos saudades do Reino Unido na União Europeia. A nós dá-nos muito jeito que o Reino Unido esteja na União Europeia. Admitimos que um dia isso possa acontecer. Não espero que o Sr. Embaixador nos fale sobre isso. Mas para nós é muito importante ter na União Europeia, na minha perspectiva, o único grande poder europeu que nunca teve um projeto de domínio continental. Isso é uma grande segurança para países médios e pequenos, e isso explica também boa parte do relacionamento do Reino Unido com os países escandinavos, com a Polónia, com o sul de Itália, com a Grécia, etc. Isso faz parte também da história. E para quem tem uma visão de uma Europa multipolar, policêntrica, a presença desse grande poder do quadro da União Europeia era sempre um conforto. Muito obrigado.
Boa tarde a todos. Senhor Presidente da Sociedade Histórica da Independência de Portugal, Dr. José Ribeiro e Castro, ilustres membros da Sociedade, distinguidos colegas diplomáticos, convidados, senhoras e senhores. Antes de mais, permitam-me expressar o meu agradecimento ao Dr. Ribeiro e Castro. Sinto-me muito honrado como convite para participar nesta tertúlia. É claro que esta é uma grande oportunidade para vos oferecer algumas reflexões mais ou menos pessoais sobre 2 assuntos que são, obviamente, extremamente relevantes para qualquer embaixador britânico em Portugal, nomeadamente a nossa antiga aliança entre os nossos 2 países e a monarquia britânica e o nosso novo monarca, Sua Majestade o Rei Carlos III. Eu sei que o tema da vossa última tertúlia foi a língua portuguesa no mundo. E para ser muito sincero, isso me deixa um pouco envergonhado pelo fato do meu próprio domínio da língua portuguesa ser tão limitado. E, portanto, com a vossa licença e para evitar infligir mais dor aos vossos ouvidos por maltratar a vossa bela língua, Vou continuar a minha apresentação na língua inglesa, a língua na qual não posso dar as mesmas desculpas. So, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me for switching into English, but thank you very much. As I said, it's a very great pleasure to be here this afternoon. And I want to start off by diving straight in and talking a bit about the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, to which Dr. Ribeiro e Castro has already given us an excellent introduction. This is, of course, a subject of very special relevance this year because, as I think you will all be aware, we will celebrate in June the 650th anniversary of the signing of the first of the great Anglo-Portuguese treaties, the so-called Treaty of Perpetual Friendships, Unions and Alliances, that was signed at the old St. Paul's Cathedral on the 16th of June, 1373 in London, by representatives of Dom Fernando and Dona Leonor of Portugal and King Edward III of England. And there is, of course, this wonderful organization, Portugal UK 650, which is organizing, or has been organizing for the last year or two, an amazing series of events and activities to commemorate and celebrate this great anniversary. And they have planned a very exciting event at St. Paul's Cathedral on or around the 16th of June of this year to mark that great anniversary. And we're very hopeful that we will be able to do that in the presence of His Majesty the King. And I would also very much like to hope that His Excellency, the President of the Portuguese Republic, might also be present at that event. But anyway, I will have a bit more to say about that 1373 treaty. But before I do, I would just like to wind the clock back another 200 years, because I believe that the first seeds of the Anglo-Portuguese alliance were sown in the year 1147. And it's worth recalling that 1147 is very, very early in the story of Portugal, because it was, I think, in 1139, only a few years before that Afonso Henriques declared Portugal independent of the Kingdom of Leon and declared himself king of this new Portuguese entity. And I use the phrase Portuguese entity because, of course, it's also important to remember that the Portugal we're talking about at that point in the 12th century was really only the most northerly part of what we think of as Portugal today. And pretty much everything south of the Douro was still under Muslim domination, as was most of the Iberian Peninsula at that time. And Afonso Henriques was a great warrior and very ambitious, and of course he set about pushing the boundaries of his kingdom southward. But I think the great city of Lisbon, which had been under Muslim rule for four centuries, in those early years must have seemed well out of reach. But then something interesting happened. In 1145, news reached the Pope, Eugene III, of Muslim military gains in the Holy Land. And the Pope was worried about this and determined that the Crusader territories in the Middle East should remain Christian. So he called on Western Christendom to mount what became the ill-fated Second Crusade. And I say the word ill-fated because armies were mobilized in France and Germany and marched across Europe, but they were halted and they were defeated in Turkey. And the crusade was, in the end, a humiliation for the Pope and for his patron, St. Bernard. But the Second Crusade also had what was perhaps an unintended consequence in Iberia, which had huge implications for this nascent kingdom of Portugal. Because in the spring of 1147, a fleet of 164 ships set sail from Dartmouth in Devon, in England. And it is believed that they were carrying some 13,000 men, armed crusaders, about half of whom were English, and the rest from the Low Countries, from Normandy, from Germany, from Scotland. Their plan, of course, was to sail down the Atlantic coast and then eastward along the Mediterranean before joining up with the Second Crusade. But the fleet ran into an Atlantic storm off the Portuguese coast and decided to take shelter in Porto, where they landed on the 16th of June. And when Dom Afonso Henriques realized that he had this great army of 13,000 armed Christian warriors on his doorstep, he was quick to spot the opportunity. And basically he persuaded the Crusaders, instead of reboarding their ships and continuing their voyage, he persuaded them to march south with his own forces and lay siege to the city of Lisbon. And so that's what happened. The combined Portuguese, English, and Northern European forces laid siege to Lisbon in early July, and 4 months later, the exhausted, starving Muslim defenders surrendered the city. Now, there is, I think, some dispute among historians about what happened next, but I think it's fair to assume that there was a good deal of looting and pillaging and generally fairly despicable behavior by the Crusaders. Of course, that was almost certainly the incentive that Afonso Henriques had used to persuade them to fight in the first place. But the reason for telling this story is because it is, I believe, the earliest example of English and Portuguese military collaboration. And the capture of Lisbon, which soon afterwards, as you all know, became the capital of the Kingdom of Portugal, was a very significant moment in the early history of this country. And for me, a really fascinating part of this story is that although most of the non-English Crusaders duly returned to their ships and sailed onto the Holy Land, many of the English chose to remain in Portugal. Many settled in Lisbon, the most famous of whom was a fellow by the name of Gilbert of Hastings, who went on to become Lisbon's first bishop. And many of these Englishmen were granted land and farmsteads in the area around Lisbon by Afonso Henriques in places like Vila Franca de Xira. And I find it really, really extraordinary to think that thousands of Englishmen settled in Portugal in the 12th century. I'm hearing an echo. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to conclude that perhaps one of the reasons why Portugal and England found it relatively natural and straightforward to conclude a formal military alliance 200 years later was precisely because of this extraordinary event in the 12th century. But let's now move forward 200 years. Why was it that Portugal and England came together and signed this historic treaty in 1373? And the answer, of course, has to do with power politics, with the great strategic chess game that was being played out between the great European powers throughout the Middle Ages. England and France were at war. It was the 100 Years' War. And in 1369, France had entered into an alliance with the Kingdom of Castile. And this news was greeted with great concern in England, because Castile had a powerful navy and the English were determined to prevent the French from getting their hands on that. And there was another factor, or indeed another person who is very relevant in this story. John of Gaunt, who was the youngest son of King Edward III of England, was a very powerful figure. He was the Duke of Lancaster, and he had married the daughter of the King of Castile, which he believed gave him a legitimate claim to the throne of Castile. So I think for all of those reasons, an alliance with the King of Portugal, the sworn enemy of Castile, must have seemed a logical step for the English. And of course, from Portugal's point of view, a security guarantee from a powerful northern ally was precisely the protection they needed from the predatory Castilians. And I think those were sort of basically the factors that led to the great treaty of 1373 that we are celebrating this year. However, if the English plan had been to defeat Castile, to install John of Gaunt on the Castilian throne and force the French to the negotiating table, well, it failed. None of those things happened, and in 1383, Dom Fernando died, and his only daughter, rather inconveniently, was married to the King John of Castile, who therefore saw a perfect opportunity to assert his claim to the Portuguese throne and basically annex Portugal to Castile. But many Portuguese had very different ideas, and they moved to install Dom Fernando's illegitimate half-brother, João of Avis, on the Portuguese throne. But all of this meant that Portugal was very unstable. And in order to consolidate his position as king, Dom João of Aviz desperately needed help. So he sent instructions to his ambassador in London to invoke the 1373 treaty and request English support. And in the end, the English sent a quite modest force of about 800 soldiers, mostly skilled longbowmen, archers, to help defend the Portuguese kingdom against Castile. And perhaps rather surprisingly, this was very effective. The Portuguese inflicted a number of impressive defeats on the Castilians, most famously at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385, when the Castilians were pretty decisively beaten and driven out of Portuguese territory. And I think anyone who's visited the incomparable Dominican convent at Batalha, built to commemorate that famous Portuguese victory, can immediately understand what a hugely important moment this was in Portuguese history. But I think it was also the moment when the Anglo-Portuguese alliance really came of age. Because the following year, a new revamped treaty of alliance was signed at Windsor between representatives of João of Aviz and King Richard II of England. And the year after that, in 1387, John of Gaunt sent his daughter, Philippa of Lancaster, who was a very remarkable woman, to Portugal to marry Dom João. And so the alliance, in a sense, became incorporated into the royal houses of both countries. King João and Philippa had a number of famous children, often referred to as the Inclita Geração. In England, the most famous of them is the infant Henrique, whom we usually call Henry the Navigator, who is often regarded as the original architect of the Portuguese Age of Discoveries, which of course brought fabulous power and wealth to Portugal over the next 150 years. Now, I'm very conscious that you are all much more knowledgeable about Portuguese history than I am, and I'm telling you stories that you almost certainly already know. I think my point is really just to emphasize the extent to which Portugal's destiny, right from the very beginning, was to some extent bound up with this notion of alliance with England. And of course, like most alliances, it was a product of strategic and military interests. But I think those treaties also created the conditions for commerce and trade between the two countries to flourish, which is exactly what happened over the 2 or 3 centuries that followed. England and Portugal became very important trading partners in commodities like cloth, textiles, and wine. And I will say a bit more about the Portuguese wine industry, because that is a subject which is very close to the heart of any British ambassador in Portugal. But first, let's just skip forward to the 17th century. And in 1640, as this very building powerfully reminds us, Portugal broke free from Spanish rule and installed Dom João of the House of Bragança on the Portuguese throne. And that meant that Portugal was back as an independent European power with its many valuable colonial possessions, and there was a bit of a scramble to forge new alliances. And for once, the English were not as well placed to take advantage as they might have been, even though King John IV was very keen to rebuild the ancient alliance with England after 60 years of rule from Madrid. England, of course, was about to embark on its own bloody civil war in 1642, which ended with the trial and execution of King Charles I in 1649, the exile of his son Charles II in 1651, and the suspension of the English monarchy. France, on the other hand, moved quickly to take advantage of the changed circumstances in Portugal and signed a new treaty of alliance with Portugal in Paris in 1641. But, and who could possibly have foreseen this, the French turned out to be a rather unreliable ally, because 18 years later, they signed the Treaty of the Pyrenees with Spain and effectively abandoned their Portuguese and Catalan allies. That was perhaps not the smartest move by the French, because of course, Charles II was just about to be restored to the English throne. And this time, the English wasted no time in renewing their relations with Portugal and negotiating the marriage of King Charles with the daughter of King John IV, Catarina de Bragança, who became our Portuguese queen in 1662. And I find Catarina de Bragança a fascinating and slightly tragic, enigmatic figure. This was certainly not a marriage that either party would have chosen for any reason other than political expediency. Charles was undoubtedly not an easy husband. He had a succession of mistresses who bore him many children. Catarina was, of course, a Roman Catholic, and we're told that she struggled with the English language, was generally disliked and rather humiliated, I think, by the English court. She had several miscarriages. She was unable to provide King Charles with an heir, and we know that his advisors wanted him to divorce her and to remarry a more fertile Protestant woman. But there must have been something there, because Charles refused to divorce Catarina, and there does seem to be evidence that he was unhappy with the way she was treated, and that he insisted that she was to be shown proper respect. And it seems that those who actually got to know Catarina, including members of the royal family, felt very great affection for her. But it was above all a transactional marriage, and Catarina's dowry, of course, included the North African port of Tangier, the islands of Bombay in India, and 2 million Portuguese crowns. I don't know how much 2 million Portuguese crowns is. Perhaps you do, but it sounds like a lot of money. Here's a rather touching little story, which I confess that I found on Wikipedia, so it must be true. When Charles lay on his deathbed in 1685, he is said to have received a message from Catarina in which she begged his forgiveness. And he is said to have replied, "Alas, poor woman, she asks for my pardon, I beg hers with all my heart." I think that's quite a touching story, even if it's apocryphal. Now, I did say I would return to the subject of wine, very important subject of wine. In the year 1703, one of my most distinguished ambassadorial predecessors, by the name of John Methuen, negotiated a new commercial treaty between England and Portugal. And this trade agreement, as I'm sure many of you will know much better than me, is, I believe, even to this day, the subject of controversy among Portuguese historians who argue about whether or not it brought real benefit to the Portuguese economy. It certainly created very favorable conditions for the export of English textiles and other commodities to Portugal, and it may well be that this held back the Industrial Revolution here in Portugal. On the other hand, it also created very favorable conditions for the export of Portuguese wine to England, ensuring that Portuguese wine could in practice be sold much more cheaply than French wine in England. And this was an absolute game changer for the Portuguese wine industry. Overnight, there was insatiable demand for the splendid wines produced in the north of Portugal. And British merchants started to arrive in Porto to buy and ship wine to England. Some of them settled in Portugal, and in time, they began to buy vineyards and land along the banks of the River Douro. Basically, they went from wine merchants to wine makers. But the rapid growth of the wine industry in the first half of the 18th century that was provoked by the Methuen Treaty also caused a marked deterioration in the quality. And this is the point at which the Marquês de Pombal enters the story, because in 1756, he nationalized wine production in the Douro region. This was not a popular move with the English at the time, but it did bring much needed quality control to Portuguese wine. Most of the British winemakers survived and thrived, and to this day, families of British origin, but who are now every bit as Portuguese as they are British, are still very prominent in the production of Portugal's world-famous port wine. So what about the alliance in the 19th century? Well, so many brilliant books and papers have been written about the Peninsular War that I rather feel that anything I say is going to be superficial and superfluous, because you all probably know this story much better than I do. But there are, of course, two great English names, Beresford and Wellesley, that are kind of indelibly written into Portuguese history, because they were the generals who commanded the British forces alongside the Portuguese and towards the end of the Peninsular War, the Spanish forces, who obstinately resisted Napoleon's attempts to capture the Iberian Peninsula, with who knows what consequences for Portugal. Wellesley, who, as you all know, went on to become the Duke of Wellington, is associated with many famous episodes in Portuguese military history, not least, of course, the defense of Lisbon through the celebrated Linhas de Torres Vedras, which the French were famously unable to penetrate. But in the interest of time, I am going to skate over the Napoleonic period, and also, I'm afraid, over the difficult episode of the British ultimatum of 1890, when British and Portuguese territorial claims clashed in southern Africa. It was not a glorious moment for relations between our two countries. I think by the time of the outbreak of the Boer War in 1899, the diplomatic damage had largely been repaired, but equally, I wouldn't underestimate the fallout in terms of Portuguese domestic politics and the implications for the Portuguese monarchy. But instead, I would rather say a few words about the path of the Anglo-Portuguese alliance in the 20th century, and in particular in relation to the two world wars. I think it's fair to say that it was Portugal's determination to protect its alliance and its trading relations with the United Kingdom that eventually undermined its neutrality in the First World War. And that led to Germany's declaration of war against Portugal in 1916, and ultimately to the sacrifice of 12,000 Portuguese soldiers, many of them fighting in terrible conditions alongside the British in the trenches in Northern Europe. And I'm not sure that terrible sacrifice has ever been adequately appreciated or recognized. Though a few years ago, a beautiful pair of stained glass windows was unveiled at St. James's Catholic Church in Strawberry Hill in Twickenham, southwest London, to commemorate the Portuguese who died in the First World War. And you might be wondering, what is the significance of that place? The answer is that it was the church at which Dom Manuel II worshipped for the remaining years of his life after his exile from Portugal in 1910. But the story of the alliance in the Second World War is extremely interesting. Prime Minister Churchill famously invoked the 1373 treaty in the House of Commons in 1943, and another of my remarkable predecessors, by the name of Sir Ronald Campbell, persuaded Salazar, on the basis of Portugal's duty to the ancient treaties, to allow the Allies to establish a military base on the island of Terceira in the Açores. And this allowed the British and the Americans to turn the tide against the German U-boats in the Atlantic and reduce the appalling loss of Allied merchant shipping across the Atlantic. But it was also a very delicate piece of diplomacy, because until that point in the war, Ambassador Campbell had been advising London against putting too much pressure on neutral Portugal, because of the risk that it would drive Franco into Hitler's arms and lead to German occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, which would have been game over for Allied interests in Portugal. And of course, no one could be quite sure how Salazar would respond to an appeal from the British. But it worked when it had to in 1943, and Churchill later said or wrote that that had been one of the great turning points of the Second World War. And finally, to bring the story of the alliance into my own lifetime, in 1982, when Margaret Thatcher sent a huge naval task force to the South Atlantic to recover the Falkland Islands from Argentina, Portugal again provided Britain with military facilities in the Açores. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my very inadequate and incomplete account of what I think is a truly wonderful story, spanning 900 years of shared history between our two countries. I find it endlessly fascinating, but of course it leaves quite an important question unanswered. What is the relevance of this story to our two countries today? What, if anything, does this ancient alliance mean in the year 2023, in this connected, globalized world with Portugal and the United Kingdom both at the heart of the Euro-Atlantic alliance, even if we are no longer both members of the European Union? I think there are several ways of trying to answer this question, but I think at the heart of it is the fact that our history is important. It tells us a great deal about who we are. It shapes what we stand for. And in June of last year, the Portuguese President and Prime Minister visited London, and Prime Minister Costa met Prime Minister Johnson at number 10 Downing Street, and the two Prime Ministers actually inspected the original text of the 1372 Treaty of Tagild, which was brought specially to Downing Street from the National Archives. And they then had a very interesting conversation about our shared priorities and how our two countries could work together in the future. I was fortunate to be at that meeting, at which they also signed a new agreement, a joint declaration on bilateral cooperation, so it's a bit of a mouthful, which sets out a detailed framework for collaboration in a wide range of areas covering security, defense, foreign policy, science, education and research, trade and investment, tourism, and culture. It also commits our two countries to working together to tackle some of the great global challenges of our times, including climate change, energy security, the protection of our oceans. It's quite an inspiring vision, and it certainly gives me and my successors plenty of work to do in the coming years. And I have no doubt that we were able to agree a wide-ranging agreement of this kind, in part because of our very long history of cooperation and understanding of one another. So although sometimes some people can be a bit dismissive of the importance of the ancient Anglo-Portuguese alliance, I don't see it that way, especially at a time when we are witnessing so much disruption in the world. War in Eastern Europe, climate emergency, global energy crisis, the aftermath of the terrible pandemic. It seems to me that the alliance between Britain and Portugal does remain relevant and important, and it's our job to ensure that it remains a force for good in the world. Now, I promised Dr. Ribeiro y Castro that I would also say a few words about the monarchy and about our new monarch, His Majesty King Charles III. Now, I should say, I have to be a little careful because I am, of course, His Majesty's ambassador. I'm in his service, and some might think it a little presumptuous of me to comment on my boss. So I will choose my words quite carefully. But Charles Philip Arthur George, to give him his full set of Christian names, was born in November 1948. And in February 1952, when he was 3 years old, his mother acceded to the British throne. And Charles therefore became the heir apparent. As Prince of Wales, he remained heir apparent for 70 years until last September, when he finally acceded to the throne himself at the age of 73, an age when most of us are well into our retirement. And as if that's not hard enough, his predecessor, who was of course his mother, was of course one of the most famous, celebrated, recognizable and beloved human beings in the world. So what do we know about our new king? Well, let me give you a few facts. He was educated at a Scottish boarding school. He studied at Trinity College, Cambridge. He served in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force in the 1970s. In 1981, he married Lady Diana Spencer. They had 2 children, William and Harry. They divorced in 1996, and the following year, Princess Diana died tragically in a horrific road accident in Paris. Some years later, Charles remarried Camilla Parker Bowles. But what do we know about King Charles as a person? What are his interests? Well, we know, for example, that from his extensive repertoire of speeches and writings, that he is a keen horticulturalist, an organic farmer, very passionate and knowledgeable about sustainability and many other very relevant environmental issues. Indeed, for several decades, he has been warning us about the impact of climate change. We know that he is very passionate about social justice. He's done extraordinary work over his lifetime in support of many charities and other organizations, in particular his own organization, the Prince's Trust, supporting disadvantaged young people. We know that he's a great lover of the arts and is a traditionalist, very passionate, for example, about the conservation of historic buildings and architecture. And these are all things we know because they are, in the main, things that he has chosen to share with us. There are lots of things that many of us think we know because we've read them in the tabloid newspapers and magazines, watched them on Netflix, and so on. And there is this whole industry in the United Kingdom with tentacles that reach all over the world that kind of feeds off stories about the British royal family. And it's a competitive space because everyone involved is trying to come up with a more colorful, more exciting, more newsworthy story than the last one. And very often these stories are written in such a way that we are almost always invited to take a side, to attribute blame, or to have an opinion about every aspect of the lives of every member of this family. But what I feel, and I do stress that this is a personal view, I feel that all of this really is essentially a great avalanche of speculation. And I sometimes wonder what it would be like if my family was subjected to that kind of never-ending public scrutiny, day in, day out, year after year. I can't really imagine how intolerable it would be and the kind of stress and strain that it would put on me and my loved ones and our relationships. I'm not going to talk about Harry, Meghan, Prince Andrew, any of that. I think my point is really just a simple one. We ask a great deal of this family, and we tend to set very high standards for them, which go far beyond what we generally expect of ourselves and others. And I think that is fundamentally unfair, and I think it has contributed to much unnecessary misery and unhappiness over many, many years. And my view, and once again I stress it's a personal view, is that it is very reasonable to expect our monarch, our ruler, to do his or her job well, to represent us and our interests to the best of his or her ability within the obvious constitutional constraints. But that the rest really is nothing to do with us. And Her late Majesty, the Queen, did her job to perfection for more than 70 years. King Charles has been in the job for a few months and has already, I believe, demonstrated an extraordinary ability to lead and to communicate. I don't know if you heard or remember the first time he addressed the British nation one day after the death of the Queen. I thought it was an amazing speech, delivered in the most difficult and most upsetting circumstances imaginable. But he absolutely touched the heart of our nation, and I think he was exactly the new king we wanted and needed him to be. But we are at a difficult time in our country's recent history. We've seen unusual political turmoil in the UK over the last few years, certainly since our decision to leave the European Union in 2016. We've lived through a devastating pandemic. We are all, one way or another, deeply affected by the plight of our Ukrainian friends in their resistance to Putin's invasion. Our economy is in a fragile state, and in the UK, our own union of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland is under pretty unprecedented strain. And it has sometimes struck me that it would be very hard to devise a more complicated set of problems and issues for a new head of state to inherit. But I also feel very confident and reassured that His Majesty King Charles, whom I absolutely believe to be a thoughtful, interesting, deeply compassionate man, is exactly the person and the monarch we need to lead us, to guide us, and to provide us with the stability we need through what I'm fairly sure will be some very challenging times ahead. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado pela vossa atenção. I'm sorry. You've heard a lot. You've heard a lot from me, but Dr. Ribeiro e Castro challenged me to recommend a book that you all might like to read, and so I thought long and hard about this, and I kept coming back to a book that I actually read quite recently, and I apologize if you all know this book, but I thought I would, in any case, introduce it to you, just in case it was not familiar. So this is the book. I'm not sure I see. Let me tell you what it's called. The title of the book is The First Global Village, How Portugal Changed the World, and it's written by Martin Page. And let me just say a few words about this book. Martin Page was an extraordinarily talented British journalist. He, in the 1960s, I think, when he was in his 20s, he was working for the Manchester Guardian. He was posted all over the world in just about every war zone you could possibly imagine. And he was a very, very celebrated foreign correspondent. I think he was the youngest bureau chief ever in Moscow. And he clearly had a very, very bright and glittering career as a journalist ahead of him as a young man. When he was in his 40s, I think, he very sadly, he began to suffer from a medical condition which affected his eyesight, and he started to go blind. And this meant that he was really unable to pursue the journalistic career that he'd always wanted to. And in the 1980s, he and his family, by which time I think he more or less lost his sight, he and his family moved to Portugal, and they moved to a house near Sintra, a country that he'd clearly fallen in love with, and he spent the next few years writing this book. I think the book was published in around about 2000 or 2001, and very, very sadly, Martin Page died the following year. But this book is a wonderful legacy that he's left behind, particularly for anyone who's interested in Portugal. And I recommend it because I found it an absolutely compelling read from the first page to the last. It's a great sweep through Portuguese history. It's not a scholarly history of Portugal, but it is well researched, I believe, and it's very, very interestingly written, as you'd expect from a journalist of his caliber. And basically, his thesis is that Portugal, by dint of its extraordinary kind of maritime history and its outward-looking kind of history going all the way back 500-600 years, was really the sort of template, if you like, for the modern world in which we live, the globalized world in which we live. Portugal was the country that was making connections all over the globe long before the rest of us. Anyway, perhaps you already know this book, but if not, and if you can get hold of a copy, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a great read. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much for your excellent speech, your presentation, both concerning the British Luso-British Alliance or Anglo-Portuguese Alliance, and also about King Charles III. I share entirely your words about the unfairness of the treatment of the royal family, and I wish him the best success as King of England and the United Kingdom. I have your regards sent by Ricardo Sonderman, who was following us from YouTube. He is the chairman of Churchill Society in Brazil, and he conveys his best regards to you, so message transmitted. E agora podemos ouvir alguns comentários, perguntas. Eu pedia que o Sr. Almirante, o Sr. Embaixador... Então, vamos começar com estes dois. O Sr. Almirante Henrique da Fonseca é o presidente do nosso Conselho Supremo. Chairman of our Supreme Council.
Sr. Embaixador, muito obrigado pela sua excelente intervenção, mas eu iria pôr uma questão mais sobre a política externa do Reino Unido, propriamente sobre a história das relações entre Portugal e o Reino Unido. Mas primeiro gostava de dizer que na minha carreira na Marinha tive muitos contactos com a Royal Navy, que por mim sempre foi vista como uma referência e como um exemplo de profissionalismo. A Royal Navy recebeu recentemente 2 porta-aviões, navios de grande porte, e julgo que o primeiro, o Queen Elizabeth, se não me falha a memória, teve a sua primeira missão operacional, foi para o Pacífico. E aquilo que eu perguntaria é qual é a importância que o Reino Unido vê na bacia do Atlântico. Muito obrigado.
Embaixador Mário Godinho de Matos.
Boa tarde. Thank you very much for your very interesting intervention. I think that I must speak in Portuguese. Seria muito interessante, creio que para todos nós, ouvir da sua parte, enfim, qual é a sua percepção sobre o futuro da nossa aliança neste mundo tão desordenado, entre aspas, em que vivemos, sobretudo agora que Portugal, obviamente, continua membro da União Europeia, que o Reino Unido está fora dela, mas em que temos, de alguma maneira, um elo em comum, que é a nossa relação especial também com os Estados Unidos, e isso tem a ver com Lajes e Açores, e, obviamente, a relação especialíssima do Reino Unido com os Estados Unidos. Gostaria de lhe pedir se nos podia elaborar um bocadinho sobre podemos chamar este triângulo de interesses, e se Portugal poderia, enfim, baseado exatamente em toda a tradição da nossa relação com o Reino Unido, desempenhar aqui um papel nesta área do relacionamento que tem o Oceano Atlântico como centro. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Mais alguém? Ok. Pronto. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for those two excellent and thought-provoking questions, both of which I think relate in many ways to foreign policy. So first of all, well, I'm delighted that your experience of sort of bilateral contact with the British Navy, the Royal Navy, was a happy one, and that it was, as you described it, I think a point of reference or a reference point for the Portuguese Navy as well. Yes. I think you're right that the first voyage of the carrier was a sort of Pacific-bound voyage. I don't think it's a case of either or between the Atlantic and the Pacific for the UK. I think we are still a country that aspires to have, to some degree, sort of global reach in our foreign and security policy. There's no doubt, and you will have heard British governments and British ministers in recent years talking a great deal about the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region, and the strategic importance of, and I think that's probably part of the explanation as to why we sent our great new naval assets in that direction early on. But I do think that everyone who's served as foreign or defense minister, or indeed prime minister of the United Kingdom in recent times, and we have had a few prime ministers, it's true, I think they all share the view that that we remain a country that is very much anchored in the Euro-Atlantic space, and that Atlantic security is fundamentally important to our future and that of our friends and allies and neighbours. So as I say, it's not an either-or, but it's just, I think, the UK continuing to try to exercise reach that takes us all around the globe. In terms of the future of the British-Portuguese alliance, And there was a sort of a question embedded in that around the fact that Portugal remains in the European Union and the UK has left the European Union. Well, I think I spoke in my talk about this agreement that we signed, our two prime ministers signed last year, which I think gives some indication of what we think the future looks like bilaterally between our two countries. And of course, I was very involved in the negotiations that led up to the conclusion of that agreement. And I think what we learned was that there's far more that unites us, far more that unites us than separates us as old allies. And all of those areas that we agreed to cooperate on, I don't think at any point we felt that the fact that one of us was inside the European Union, one of us was outside the European Union, was in any way a constraint on the sort of things that we wanted to do together as countries in the future. And I mean, it's a kind of obvious point, but let's not forget that the European Union is just over 50 years old, or at least UK membership would have been 50 years old, I think, this year, and Portugal has been in for less time than that. England and Portugal have been allies since the 14th century. So, I think in the sort of broad sweep of history, we've got a relationship that is deeply historic and unique, and provides a fantastic platform for future cooperation. And I mean, that's very much how I see my job here is to carry that forward, and the reason why we pushed hard to get an agreement signed by our two prime ministers last year. I do feel optimistic about very optimistic about the future. And as I tried to argue when I was standing at the microphone over there, I think that the alliance remains relevant and important today, and we need to make it relevant and important for the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I hope, as I said, that the United Kingdom rejoins the EU, or at least that the relationship evolves well, like with other EFTA members like Norway, Switzerland, Iceland.
It's difficult for me to comment on this.
Yes, I know. But I go back to the referendum, and I regret. I think Nigel Farage himself went to bed on that night thinking he had lost the referendum. Yeah. And it was a pity, but because I think that if the yes had won, we have had a very enthusiastic wave of British commitment to a more open EU and a more decentralized and multipolar EU. And of course, we need obvious that drive, because centralization forces are very strong in the center of the empire, and that's not good. And so I believe that we will keep a close relationship with UK. It's a European partner that we always have been. We share the same presence in NATO, and so very close cooperation in terms of defense and external foreign policy. And well, I hope we stay together. That's very good. And thank you very much for your presentation, your presence. I have here a small book about our palace that is cited in your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And all the best.
Thank you.
To you.